But with these fretboards, they actually pop out, and then you pop in a new one with the correct tuning. So how many different temperaments have you been working with, and what are the applications of those?
Yeah. So the number of possible fretboards, is virtually infinite. But just because the theoretical possible number of tunings is infinite doesn't mean that there isn't a much smaller practical number. So the number of tunings that I've been working with, and I should say I've been working with in terms of in our company, is a larger number than I would even recommend to any one guitarist.
Hmm.
So the way I think of it is right now in my kind of tunings folder that I have on my computer to generate these fretboards, it's probably around 24 or so different like tuning systems that I have. For a sort of average run-of-the-mill everyday guitar player, I would say they would probably do just fine with 4.
Hmm.
Unless, I mean, I would anticipate though that someone would get to the point where they maybe hear something or want to experiment with one of the other tunings, and then they can always order another fretboard later and add to their collection. But I would say 4. Like, so for example, for the last year, all of my recitals I've been doing on just 4 fretboards. So, usually my concerts are split into 2 halves, so the little intermission. The first half, I will come out on stage with, 1 fretboard, and I'll have the others just sort of set up on a little table off to the side of where I'm playing. And I'll do a sort of set of pieces in a particular tuning. And then I'll switch out fretboards. Takes about 5 seconds. It literally just sort of slides right out, and the other one slides in. They're held on magnetically, so there are no moving parts or anything to like mess with. I'll switch the other one, and I might have to make some tiny adjustments to the tuning of the open strings as a given temperament, maybe changes. But the changes are very slight, not even anything like, when you go to drop D tuning and your low D string wants to return to the E, none of the changes are nearly as large as that. So I'll check my open strings, do the next set, intermission, and then kind of the same thing in the second half. So like the last concert I played right before the coronavirus lockdown happened was, of all places, in Seattle. I played this concert like basically a week before the news came out about that nursing home in Kirkland, Washington. And in that concert, I did what was, a somewhat conventional classical guitar program, but my take on it was that I'm going to play a fair amount of standard classical guitar repertoire, but I'll be doing each of the pieces in the tuning of the time it was written, as opposed to the way most people do it, which is this very anachronistic idea of, well, I'll play Renaissance music in a very 20th century tuning, which is equal temperament. Then I'll play Baroque music in a 20th century tuning. Then I'll do a classical piece in a 20th century tuning. I was like, well, why? Let's hear these things in the tuning of the era. So yeah, I would come out with, my fretboard that was, in the Renaissance tuning, and then I would switch to the Baroque tuning fretboard, and then I would had my classical era fretboard. And actually, now that I think of it, the Seattle concert I did on just 3 fretboards. So yeah, I had the Renaissance, the Baroque, and the classical tunings. And then in the second half, I did a modern piece that was written in 1994 by the really great, if not greatest, living classical guitar composer, in my opinion, Dusan Bogdanovic, who teaches in Switzerland now and used to teach in San Francisco for many years. And I did a piece that he wrote in the 90s, but I played it in the Baroque tuning because the particular sort of modal language that he was using in this piece, full of really rich thirds and sixths, and it's just beautifully manifested in a Baroque tuning. So I hope that answered your question. Virtually infinite number of tunings in the cosmos.
Hmm.
I'm working with about 24 right now, but certainly that'll expand. But for actual performers, talking about a concert, I'd say 3 or 4, or for that matter, you could do a whole concert on just 1. And then if you have a concert the next day, you could do that on a different fretboard. That's kind of how I'm thinking of it.
Gotcha. So with these different tunings, how do you break them down mathematically? Like, what makes something a Renaissance tuning?
Yeah. So so the sort of historical development of the European tunings starts really back with Pythagoras, who was, as we know from whatever junior high or elementary school, there's like the Pythagorean theorem, which I don't actually remember right now. I'm sure your listeners will be saying, well, of course, it's the square root of the side. I don't even know. Okay. So there's Pythagoras, right? This noted Greek mathematician and geometer. But what many people don't know or don't learn in their math classes is that he was also deeply, deeply interested in music and the mathematics of music. So a lot of the work that he did, or as we understand it today, had to do with the relationship between proportional string lengths and their resultant sonorities, right? So there's this really like deeply fascinating relationship between geometry and music, right?
Mm.
So to sort of make a little bit of a long story short, one of the insights or discoveries that Pythagoras made was that when you take the interval that we would today call a perfect fifth and tune it absolutely pure, a few interesting things happen. For one thing, in our modern language, we know that there's a frequency ratio of 3 to 2. The upper note of the perfect fifth is vibrating 3 times for every 2 times of the lower note. There's also a geometrical relationship, which is that if you have 2 strings that are the same material and the same tension and everything, like let's say you have 2 strings and they're tuned identically, they're the same in every way. If you put a little bridge or a fret, for that matter, any kind of stopper, at the 2/3 length of the other one, you'll go from the unison, and you put the little bridge in there at 2/3 of the length, and you get this perfect fifth relationship. So there's this interesting sort of inverse relationship between the upper note is 2/3 of the length, but then the frequency ratio is that the shorter string vibrates 3 times for every 2 times of the lower. Well, that's kind of the starting point for the so-called Pythagorean tuning. And what he discovered is that if you proceed in stacking this particular frequency ratio or geometric relationship, and you could take the shorter 2/3 string and perform that operation again, 2/3 of that, and then take that new string, 2/3 of that, and 2/3 of that, and so on and so on. You notice that when you do that 12 times, you reach a new pitch that is incredibly close to your starting pitch. Now we're going to assume that you may bring things down, transpose by an octave or something. We're going to assume octave equivalence for now. You get to a note that is very close to the starting pitch, but not identical. This is really counterintuitive, I think, for any sort of modern musician who's been trained at a school of music or conservatory or something. We're very used to thinking of this idea of the circle of fifths. You stack 12 perfect fifths, and voila, you end up right back where you started. That's not the case. That only works because our fifths on a equal tempered piano, they are tempered. they're flat slightly. When you tune them pure, you can think of it, instead of a circle of fifths, it's more like a spiral. You end up, relative to equal temperament, spiraling out. The new note you get to after 12 of them is sharper than where you started. And the difference, it's very small, the difference between that new 13th note, the sharper note, and your starting note, that little microtonal interval is called the Pythagorean comma. And basically all that our equal tempered system does is that it divides that little tiny interval into 12 incredibly small parts and narrows each fifth by that amount. So that when you go around, instead of spiraling out progressively, it neatly closes as a circle. Okay, let me see if I can get back to your question, which is, what's your Renaissance fretboard? I have to go back to Pythagorean tuning because it's the basis of all the European tunings up until the just intonation experiments of the 20th century. So like many ancient Greek and Roman concepts, they became really solidified and established in the European mind throughout the Middle Ages, usually without questioning them, which is part of why they're the Dark Ages, because they were just inheriting these ideas, good ideas or bad ideas, and just kind of saying, yeah, that's what Aristotle said, so it has to be true, or that's what Pythagoras said, so it had to be true. So in terms of musical practice through the Middle Ages, musicians were using as their pitch, universe, this Pythagorean tuning. So it has a couple really nice things about it, which is that the perfect intervals, the perfect fifths, and the perfect fourths are all absolutely pure. They don't beat, they're just intonation, they're fantastic. One byproduct of this, though, is that what we would today call the, like the imperfect intervals, the thirds and sixths, the resultant thirds and sixths. For example, if you go from C to G, that perfect fifth, and then G to D, and then D to A, and then A to E, and compare your starting C to the resultant E, the E that emerges from stacking pure fifths is extremely far. In fact, it's much sharper than a pure major third as it arises from the overtone series. Mm-hmm. It's horribly out of tune, really like awful sounding. This is one of the reasons why music of the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages really avoids those intervals and actually considers them dissonances, which is counterintuitive for kids, freshmen in music history class. So like, why did they consider them dissonances, but Bach doesn't consider it a dissonance? And the answer is, in the 13th century, it was incredibly dissonant because of the tuning system. And through a variety of tempering and other things that we'll talk about in a minute, that interval became consonant. It wasn't just a change in taste, as is sometimes taught in music school. There was an actual physical difference, literally like a vibratory difference between C and E in the 13th century and C and E in the 16th century. The earlier one is quite dissonant, and in the 16th century it's consonant. Okay, so to your question about the Renaissance fretboard, how did it become consonant? Well, you think about that chain of purely tuned perfect fifths, how when we stack them, we get that really awful major third. Mm-hmm. Well, just like Pythagoras compared the difference between when he stacked those 12 perfect fifths and he compared that resultant note to his starting note, we called it the Pythagorean comma. You can do a similar thing with the major third. You stack those perfect fifths till you land on a major third. We'll assume they're pure fifths in Pythagorean tuning. And if you compare that note to a pure third that would emerge from the natural harmonic series, which doesn't change whether you're in the 8th century or the 25th century, or whether you're in the Andromeda galaxy, these pure intervals have to do with just the laws of physics, right? So those aren't going to change. Anyway, if you compare that Pythagorean third to the pure one, you end up with another microtonal interval, which today we call the syntonic comma. And that interval, and the error that occurs by stacking fifths, became a real obsession of European musicians really for centuries. Like how to rectify the fundamental basis of their musical language, which was Pythagorean in spirit, based on stacking fifths. And how do you rectify that with this interval and make them two? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It's a really elegant solution. It was first written down by an Italian theorist named Pietro Aron in the early 1500s, but it was probably being used even earlier by just practicing musicians who wanted to improve the quality of that third, even though they didn't write it down. So it's pretty simple, actually. If you think about it, if you have C to G, G to D, D to A, and A to E, you have 4 perfect fifths. And you end up with this really awful sounding C to E. Let's again assume those are 4 purely tuned perfect fifths. You have that little interval. Your Pythagorean major third is too high. Your pure one is quite a bit lower, but you want to get there because you want it to be in tune. And it happens over 4 perfect fifths. So all you have to do is flatten the first perfect fifth by 1/4 of the syntonic comma. The next one by the same amount, another quarter, the next one by another quarter, and the next one by another quarter, and you have canceled out that error. So the amount that each perfect fifth is compressed, narrowed, right, is very small. It's a much smaller amount than the error, but cumulatively it tempers out and deletes the error. So you have these perfect fifths, which are not in tune. They're intentionally out of tune, but by a small amount, so that cumulatively, when it adds up, you end up with this pure major third. You get other knock-on benefits, which is that we haven't talked about the minor third, but the minor third ends up also being much more in tune. The sixths also, because they're, you know, inversions, they are also much more in tune. You get like all of these amazing benefits out of it just by narrowing the fifths. And that tuning, which again was written about first in a very clear sense in the early 1500s, became just the default tuning of European music throughout the 1500s and the 1600s, and probably well into the 1700s, though things start to get complicated, because in the 1700s, some of the inherent liabilities of that tuning system become more and more obvious, and composers need to deal with its liabilities. But that's the Renaissance tuning, and it's the first tuning other than equal temperament that I had a personal experience playing on. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it is incredibly addictive. The moment I played in this tuning, which today we call quarter comma mean tone tuning, quarter of a comma, again, comes back to that idea of flattening each fifth by 1/4 of the syntonic comma. It's so incredibly addictive, because not only is shit incredibly in tune, but it is this sort of still based on this European idea of stacked fifths. So, you know, myself being a, you know, European, I mean, I'm American, but, you know, classically trained one who plays a lot of, you know, music in a European language, you know, I could just immediately, you play even normal chord progressions. I mean, like literally even like a 1-4-5 chord progression in quarter comma mean tone tuning is like, wow, it sounds so good. I could listen to this all day. It completely rejuvenates the musical language, in my opinion.
Now, does it translate to all different keys the way that equal temperament is supposed to? Like, would those resonances work in C major and E major? No? Okay.
No. And that's exactly why in the 18th century, and even slightly before, even in the 17th century, there were some composers and musicians and theorists all sort of working together to try to solve some of the problems. So here's this mean tone tuning. It's not a panacea. It is wonderful and amazing for a limited set of keys. But here's the problem. If you remember how in the Pythagorean tuning, even in ancient Greece, you know, Pythagoras and others were working and discovered that when you stack pure fifths, they don't line up, right? They spiral outwards. When you get to that 13th note, it's not identical to your starting note in any octave. It's a little too sharp. So if you kept stacking fifths, you can imagine your spiral of fifths would spiral out to infinity. Well, the issue with doing this kind of kludgy solution for the major third, this sort of Renaissance solution of tempering them by 1/4 of the syntonic comma, has the interesting byproduct of creating a collapsing spiral. So when you go around 12 pitches, you've flattened the fifths so much that when you get to that 13th note, it's not identical to your starting note, but unlike in Pythagorean tuning where it's sharper, it's flatter. Remember, because we've flattened the fifths to bring that really nasty sharp Pythagorean major third down to the pure major third. If you keep going, let's say you start on C and you go all the way around. If you really spell out the notes, you'll find that your 13th note is a B sharp, right? Because it's a perfect fifth above E sharp, which is a perfect fifth above A sharp, right? And you keep going back. If you spell things very carefully and don't use enharmonic equivalents, right? You're really careful with the spelling. You find out in mean tone tuning that your B sharp is lower than C. And this creates a big problem because B sharp and C are not equivalent notes, right? The B sharp is lower, and that's the case for any note that we would think of as an enharmonic equivalent. So this is really kind of one of those funny counterintuitive things I discovered as I was researching this stuff, is I had it so ingrained in me from music school, this idea that enharmonic meant equivalent pitches with different names. And that is a completely ahistorical rendering of that term. That word, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, so this is a Greek word, going all the way back to there, it specifically meant two notes that are not the same pitch, but very close to each other, but definitely different frequencies. And for some reason, due to the dominance of equal temperament in the 20th century, the meaning of that word got turned into its opposite. Enharmonic means two distinctly different notes that are close to each other. And so in mean tone tuning, G sharp is lower than A flat, and C sharp is lower than D flat. I mean, you can pick any two enharmonic notes, and what you'll always find is that if you think of it alphabetically, let's go between, well, I guess between G and A is probably an easy one, right? You've got like G and you got A up here, right? The way to think of it in mean tone tuning is that a sharp changes a diatonic note by raising it, and a flat changes a diatonic note by lowering it, but they don't land on the same spot. The chromatic alteration is not extreme enough to get them to line up. So whenever you have any two enharmonic pitches, the very easy thing to just sort of kind of keep in your mind, there are two ways to think of it. You could think either the lower note in the alphabet, right? Like A, sorry, G is like, comes before A. So a G sharp is going to be lower in pitch than an A, because A is higher and G is lower. Another way to think of it is that, this is actually kind of just a nice shorthand, which is that sharps are lower than flats in their enharmonics.
Gotcha.
So coming back to your question, I'm sorry, I'm taking these wide orbits around and then
it's all good. It's super interesting.
It's at the nature of your podcast. So can you play in other keys? The answer is yeah, you can play in any key you want as long as you're using the correctly tuned enharmonic for the actual pitches you're using. So the standard set of pitches that a Renaissance, let's say, keyboard player would tune up on their organ or whatever, virginal or whatever, the kind of standard tuning for the notes is that the white keys, right, the diatonic notes are tuned as such, right? They're not going to tune the F key as an E sharp, even though now we know E sharp is lower than F, right? And for the chromatic keys, the sort of standard disposition, as it's called, is that the chromatic keys are tuned to E flat and B flat, and then you have F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp, right? So you got two flats and three sharps. That's sort of the standard tuning. Now the problem with that is if you are playing something on such a keyboard instrument in, let's say, like E minor or something, right? Everything's fine until you get to the dominant chord with the raised seventh of E minor, because of course the pitch you have there is D sharp, and you don't have a D sharp on that keyboard, you have an E flat, and D sharp is quite a bit lower than E flat. So as soon as you hit that B major chord or B dominant seventh or whatever it is, all of a sudden you're not playing, that's not a major third. Technically speaking, it's a diminished fourth, because B to E is a fourth, and if it's tuned to E flat, it's being diminished, and a diminished fourth does not sound the same as a major third. Diminished fourth is wider than a major third. And depending on your tastes, you could either say that chord sounds really spicy and interesting and exciting, or as more often than not, you will say, that sounds horrible. It's so out of tune. It's just awful, right? So this is not really an issue for people in the 16th century so much, because there's a very limited number of keys with a very strong, almost gravitational pull towards the diatonic, sort of natural notes. The idea of adding chromatic pitches you can see in the music, it almost feels like they're tentatively grasping out, like, oh, I'll pluck an F sharp, but oh, let's go back, like that chromatic scares me. Or maybe a little later, oh, let me borrow a C sharp. This idea of reaching out from the diatonic sort of core is done very carefully and somewhat rarely, right? But not to boil all of Western music history down to a simple, one-liner. But as you go on, right, composers are becoming more and more daring in their desire to reach further out to those other chromatic accidentals. And in this mean tone tuning, as soon as you reach far enough that, you know, if you're going in the flats, okay, grab a B flat, you're fine. You want one more flat? Okay, you can have E flat, but if you grab that A flat, it's going to sound as a G sharp and it's going to be really low. Or vice versa, you know, reaching too far in the sharps. In a sense, it's kind of a sort of somewhat weird comparison, but it's a bit of a sort of flat Earth concept to tonality. You sort of do have these precipitous cliffs on the two sides of this, where all of a sudden you just end up in this weird underworld where, you know, your thirds are enharmonically mistuned and things sound either really interesting or really bad depending on your tastes. You do see some examples of the breakdown of the mean tone tuning system in the 1600s, especially with composers who, depending on which musicologist you talk to, I tend to agree with the ones who say there are composers who are intentionally using the sort of quote unquote wrong enharmonic to create a kind of musical drama and deeper level of color. So, you know, sometimes that misspelled major third being very dissonant and sort of spicy sounding. The flip side of that is if you go too far on the flat side, what tends to happen is you end up with minor chords where the minor third is the opposite. Instead of being too sharp, it's way too low. So like in mean tone tuning, if you played an F minor chord, the F and C are fine, but your A flat is tuned to a G sharp. And so it's way too low, but you end up with this almost like a just deep down blue note kind of feel, like a real, like old, like real Delta bluesy kind of, like that's so flat that it's almost good. It's like a real deep, low minor third. And there's a fair amount of evidence that composers in the 1600s are using those two and those enharmonics off the cliff intentionally to create musical drama.